I think if you saw the invite email, we're going to be discussing a rather sensitive topic. But it's one that needs to be addressed because if we're going to overcome or have an impact on this trauma epidemic, we have to address the issues that are causing it. And one of the major causes of death as a result of this trauma epidemic is conflict-related violence and self-harm, and these two are tightly related. When you look at the continent of Africa and you look at how much life has been lost due to conflict over the years, it's difficult to know exactly what those numbers are. I think many of us are familiar with the approximately 450,000 deaths that occurred with the Rwandan genocide when the Tutsis were massacred. More recently, estimates as high as 600,000 Ethiopians have died due to violence within its borders. And even more difficult to get an actual number of is the amount of deaths that have occurred in the Congo region, with estimates as high as 5.4 million deaths related to conflict-related violence in the area of the Congo, making that the highest loss of life since World War II due to a conflict. And how many people here have heard of that? It's not something that we know a lot about. But I think if we're going to treat this, we have to understand what's causing it and how we can intervene and make an impact. And that's the purpose of this talk today. The purpose of this talk today is not to point fingers at various parties or political institutions. The purpose of this talk today is to make the point that conflict does exist in Africa, the continent of Africa, and understand why it occurs. And not that it's something as simplistic as ethnic tensions or poor political regimes. I think it's much more complicated than that. And when we get an understanding of that, then we can then come up with plans in terms of how to impact it. So first to start, we just want to talk about some basic definitions. So this paper here it's called Conflict Trends in Africa, and it comes out it's produced by the Peace Research Institute of Oslo. And it just looks at battle-related trends in Africa from 1989 to 2021. And they have some basic definitions. So you have state-based conflicts, and these are contested incompatibility over government and or territory with at least one party being a state, and involving the use of armed force that results in at least 25 battle-related deaths within a calendar year. Then you have non-state conflicts. This is armed force between organized groups, none of which is the government or a state, that results in at least 25 annual battle-related deaths. Then you have one-sided violence, the use of armed force by the government or a state or a formally organized group against civilians, that results in at least 25 battle-related deaths. And then all battle-related deaths or fatalities, including civilian losses caused by warring parties, and that can be directly related to combat. When you talk about Africa, the majority of conflict that you see are conflicts within states. They're within states. They're not between states typically, but these are conflicts that occur within states. So civil-type conflicts are very common in Africa compared to conflicts between states. I think that's an important thing to point out. When you look at Africa in general, I have just these maps that show state-based conflicts, and then next to that you'll see non-state conflicts, and then after that you'll see one-sided conflicts. And what you'll notice is that these are all occurring predominantly in the same areas, right? Where you have got state-based conflicts, you've also got non-state conflicts, and you've also got one-sided conflicts. So it's just an interesting point. In terms of an area where you have conflicts, they seem to be prevalent there, all types. And then in the areas that are stable, for the most part, those tend to be the stable portions of Africa. And you can see the more stable portions are the more northern portions and the more southern portions. The total number of state-based conflicts was 30 in 2020. And of those, 11 were civil wars. The remaining 19 were internationalized civil wars. So When it comes to internationalized civil wars, that's basically saying some outside actor is coming in and they're providing arms, or they're maybe fomenting a conflict. And if you look at the results of internationalized conflicts, sometimes it can be good. Sometimes other states, like America or Europe or China, can come in and help bring peace. But on the other hand, sometimes it can actually foment the war more, provide more weapons, and then increase the lethality of the war. So in terms of internationalized conflicts, state actors from outside Africa can have a positive impact, but their influence needs to be used wisely. When you look at non-state conflicts broken down between formally organized groups, informally organized groups, and informally organized identity groups, Africa is currently the region most severely affected by non-state conflicts. And I just have a list there of those. So those can be terrorist organizations, or those can be like a group within the country that represents a specific ethnicity or a specific religion, and they declare themselves a group, and then they start taking action due to some incompatibility that they have with maybe people around them. One-sided violence. Africa is the region with the largest absolute number of fatalities from one-sided violence. This type of violence is perpetuated mainly by non-state actors. A lot of these can be terrorist organizations, but other ones can be state actors. So the state can act against its own people. And when African governments get involved in this type of violence, this is where typically you see the most fatalities. An example of this is the 540,000 deaths in 1994 that occurred when the Rwandan government got involved with the genocide. So those can be very lethal. When people, and particularly when you hear something like a genocide that occurred in Rwanda, you almost have this knee-jerk response of, well, it's tribal violence or ethnic violence. These ethnicities can't get along because they can't get along. It results in this conflict and deaths. And that's just why Africa is riddled with so much conflict-related violence. But again, the point of this talk is to show that I think that is a very myopic view of what is causing a lot of this conflict-related violence in Africa. But it does need to be mentioned. It needs to be mentioned. So if you look, here's just a map, and this was taken from the Encyclopedia Britannica. If you look at this map, this shows the different ethno-linguistic groups within Africa, and then it's broken down by color into these large language families. But there is a lot of diversity in Africa. There are, if you look at this, how many, according to Ethnologue's geographical distribution of living languages, there are 2,058 languages spoken in Africa, about 30% of the world's total 6,809 living languages. So Africa, even though it's 13% of the world's population, 1 out of every 3 languages used in the world is in an African language. So it's true. There's a lot of diversity in Africa, right? And if you look at, say, the rest of the world, they average about 3.2 to 4.7 ethnic groups per country. Africa, on average, they've got about 8 in each country. And then to further complicate that, you have all of these different ethnicities in Africa. They speak different languages, but then Africa was colonized. So when Africa became colonized, you had countries from Europe coming in, and they started laying down borders. But when they laid down these borders, when France and Great Britain and other European countries started laying down borders, they didn't lay them down with respect to ethnicity. They divided their countries up in such a way that you would put within the same country some rival ethnic groups. So it did complicate the matter in terms of colonialization, and a lot of these borders still persist today. So you have borders that cut across ethnic groups, and you'll have rival ethnic groups within the same country. And you can imagine that makes things difficult. So starting out ethnically, it does look like Africa has a challenge. But what you'll see as we go through this is ethnic diversity can actually be a safeguard against conflict. There's other things involved when it comes to conflict. And one of the things that seems to be involved most in determining conflict is the economy. If there's one thing that I've learned in preparing this talk, and I think people have learned in life, hungry people are angry people. Okay? We've all gotten hangry before. But imagine if that's your life. Imagine if you can't feed your children, right? That's different. Now you're really angry. And then imagine if you see someone else who may live near you or someplace close to you or within the same country, and they're doing just fine. That creates tension. What are the economics of African nations? And what are the economics of African nations that influence conflict? Well, as we discussed in some of our previous talks, many of the poor nations in the world, many of the low-income nations of the world, in fact, Africa is home to most of the lower-income nations of the world. And what contributes to that? A lot of it is the fact that they have what's called extroverted economies. What's an extroverted economy? An extroverted economy is an economy that depends on exports. So what we have here, I have on the right of your screen or on the left of your screen is export dependence within African nations. And what you'll see is in Ethiopia there you'll see it's export dependent on agricultural products. You have some countries in blue energy, that'd be oil, natural gas. And then if you look in the center there, DR Congo, Zambia, they are dependent on ores, metals, precious stones. So, and then you've got few non-commodity dependent countries. And then if you look at this, the other on the right, total export dependence, red means they're more export dependent. And look at how much of Africa is export dependent. Why does that matter? Well, here's a graph that shows the price of tantalum. So if you're export dependent, the value of your currency is largely dependent on that export and how it's doing. So if you look at tantalum, for example, which is a mineral or a product that's used in our cell phones, much of it's derived from the Congo, look at how that price fluctuates, right? What do you think that's going to do to your currency? It's going to fluctuate it's going to fluctuate with that a lot. What about copper? The Congo produces a lot of copper. And look at the fluctuations here. So if you are an extroverted economy that depends upon your exports, how your economy does is tied to these fluctuations. You can have good times, but you can have times that are very bad. Particularly if you're somebody that's working on the lower end, and every day you only make enough just to feed your family. And if you don't show up to work that day, you don't have enough to feed your family. You can't take a sick day literally, because if you do take a sick day, you can't pay to feed yourself and your family. So, and then if the price of that commodity drops and there's no reason for them to be mining it currently, you're laid off. Now you're really in a situation. So that is something that lends itself to conflict. So we're going to go through this, and we're going to go through a little discussion here. If you want to protect yourself from that type of fluctuation in your economy, you need what's called diversification. Not only do you need to depend on what you're exporting in terms of raw minerals, but ideally you need to have people that have other skills. In other words, they can come up with ideas to create things. You can have manufacturing that manufactures different types of goods. You can take the product out of the ground, and rather than selling it in its raw form, like take, say, an emerald, a raw emerald, you can actually cut it so it can be used in jewelry. You can have your own economy where you trade amongst yourselves, so your economy can support itself. It's called economic diversification. And economic diversification protects you from these types of fluctuations. So I'm just going to go through a process here in terms of just like describing how a poor nation can fall into conflict. So we're going to start out with a poor nation that's commodity dependent, and it's low on the global value chain. And what does that mean? Global value chains are what have developed in this global economy where you provide a contribution to making a particular good. Okay? if you're low on the global value chain, what that means is you just produce the raw element. You take something out of the ground, it's basically a crushed up rock, and then you give it to somebody else. How much do you think you make off that? Very little. You make very little. Now, so if you then take, say, maybe that emerald that doesn't look that nice, it just came out of the ground, and you shine it and you polish it, now you can sell that for a little bit more. If you inset it into jewelry, you can sell that for something. And if you own the company that sells the jewelry, now you're basically taking all the profit from that. Does that make sense? When you're in the global value chain at the very bottom, you make the least out of it. What Asia has done is they've moved up the global value chain. Asia has moved, if you think about China, they've moved up the global value chain to where they're producing so much of what we use. And they're even now getting into the highest part of the global value chain where they're innovators. Not only are they producing it, but they're looking at it and they're saying, how can this iPhone be better? How can this satellite be better? And now you're at the top of the global value chain. So where Asia has climbed up the global value chain and they've raised the standard of living for their people, this has not happened in Africa. So we'll start out with a poor nation. It's commodity dependent, it's low on the global value chain. Let's say they produce uranium. Lacking the finances to develop the mines, to harvest and pay for the roadways, to transport the raw material out of the country, it takes a loan, and it's a resource-backed loan. So in other words, a rich nation comes to them and says, we want you to get us uranium. We'd like to buy it from you. They say, we would love to get it for you, but we don't have the ability to make this mine or the roadways to get it out. The rich nation replies, happy to help you with that. We'll make the roads for you. We'll make the mine for you. You have to pay us back. But here's the deal. If you don't pay us back, we get your mine. It's a bad deal, right? But this is what's occurring in a lot of nations. But this country goes for that. So they signed the deal. The loan's taken from a nation that has substantial rival nations that are also investing in Africa. So other people are eyeing this. Some other rich nation that's a world power militarily looks at it and says, boy, we would sure like that uranium. Darn it, wish we could have signed that deal. Low-wage jobs are created for many people harvesting the raw ore and making roads. And while a few are made very wealthy that are in privileged positions in the government or from a land/company ownership standpoint, others are just making a measly amount from simply digging holes in the ground and gathering this raw ore. This is how it works a lot of the time. Those in the privileged positions are of one ethnic group, while those performing the low-wage jobs are of another. The government is politically aligned with the wealthy ethnic group, while the poor ethnic groups have no voice in government and little economic upward mobility. Now, due to decreased global demand for the price of uranium, all of a sudden the world becomes a very peaceful place. We decide we don't need to spend our money on making nuclear bombs right now. Nobody wants to buy it. An economic crisis ensues, with the country being unable to service its debt, and the poverty worsens within that country. The country loses a number of its uranium mines to its creditor because they say, okay, you can't pay up. We're going to take that mine. That further worsens its losses of revenue caused by the decreased price of uranium. Now, who do you think's affected the most? The people at the very bottom. And dissatisfaction amongst impoverished ethnic groups with no voice in government and no educational or upward or economic mobility start a conflict financed by a rival nation who wants access to that country's uranium. What money the government does have, now instead of being spent on education or health care or strengthening the government, is spent on a war effort, decreasing any money that was spent on education or strengthening government systems that need to be there to place, meet basic citizens' needs. The economy worsens, decreasing prospects of diversifying the economy. You can't diversify an economy in that situation. And moving up the global value chain, who wants to invest in a country in terms of an outside nation? Who wants to invest in a business in a country that's in conflict? The answer is virtually none. That further entrenches the poverty and increases its susceptibility to other conflicts. The country's propensity for violence scares off future investors, further worsening its prospects for economic growth. So that takes you through basically kind of a stepwise progression of what happens over and over again in many African nations. There are predictive models now, a lot of them artificial intelligence, machine-based learning, that can predict civil war if it's going to occur or not occur. It's very interesting. And a lot of these go back to, this is a paper, I believe, from in the 80s or 90s, where they came up with a mathematical model to predict civil war, okay? And the whole point of these slides is just to make the point that this is not just about ethnic or linguistic differences, okay? My feeling is, when I go through this, if America, if we were in the same situation that Africa were in, America would essentially be like Africa. There is just a complexity of issues that are contributing to this problem of conflict that we are seeing there. Humans are no different here than they are in Africa. We're all exactly the same. These models work all over the world. We are currently in a very privileged position that does not make us susceptible to conflict. So if you look at, this is an early model, it simplifies it. If you look at the AI models, they're very complex, but they can supposedly predict within like 93% accuracy or 97% accuracy if a civil war is going to occur. What did they find out in some of these models? So what this shows is a probability of civil war at low and high levels of political rights and variable ethno-linguistic fractionalization. And this is a parabola here, and you can see this shows the bottom 10% of polity, and polity means that this is a government that is strong and gives voices to all of its people. So if there is a particular group within that society, by religion or ethnicity or anything else, that has a grievance, they can bring it to the nation, they can bring it to the government, and they'll feel like they're heard, and some response is made. And what you see here is that when people don't have a voice, once you get to a little bit over about 50% of ethno-linguistic fractionalization, the chance of war is very high. In other words, they said, in this model, if you have about 60% of the nation of one group and 40% of another group, and that 40% doesn't feel heard, the chance of civil war is incredibly high. On the other hand, if you just give a voice to people where they can voice their grievances and say, I don't feel like I'm being heard, look how it drops the probability of civil war. It demonstrates you need a strong government that lets different groups be heard if you're going to have something that protects against civil war. This shows the probability of civil war if you look at ethno-linguistic fractionalization, so differences that way, versus the gross domestic product. And you can see the bottom of the gross domestic product is here, and then you can see the top of the gross domestic product is here. And you can see in this model, what was more important was people being heard politically, but economics does play a role here, right? If people are poor, it gets to that point. If you're a hungry person or a hungry group, you're an angry person, an angry group. This shows if you have an economy that is extroverted or highly commodity dependent. So if you're very, very commodity dependent versus lowly commodity dependent, the lower you are in terms of being dependent on commodities, the lower your risk of a civil war. And this one shows they just put democracy and income together. So in other words, if you look at this, your risk of civil war is really high if you're poor and you aren't being heard. If everybody's doing well economically and everybody's being heard, what's your chance for civil war? It's like, right, that's a happy society, right? There's a recipe for achieving this. And this just puts them all together. It puts ethno-linguistic fractionalization, commodity dependence, and gross domestic product together. And the more diverse your economy is, the more well off your citizens are and the more they're hurt, the less chance for civil war. So the point of all this is that it's not just about ethnic and linguistic differences. It is about the economy. It is about the ability for a group of people to elevate themselves within the world economy. And it shows that we, as a world, if we're concerned about everybody in this world, that we have a part in helping some of these other nations to elevate themselves out of this trap, as I took you through that kind of whole circular process of poverty and conflict, to help elevate some of these nations out of this trap that they're in. Particularly, and this feeds into my next slide, particularly if we are benefiting from those countries, which we are. So, conflict minerals, these are called the 3 TGs, and that stands for tantalum, tin, tungsten. Those are the 3 Ts, and gold. What are conflict minerals? Well, conflict minerals primarily come from the Democratic Republic of Congo, the eastern part. Many of them are used to make our circuit boards, our cell phones, and there's a lot of conflict related to this. Many deaths have occurred in this region. Like I said, estimates as high as 5.4 million. And what you have is you have rivaling factions that will want to harvest this raw ore and then put it on the world stage to enter it into these global value chains that are then used to make cell phones and these things that we want, or military technology. And this just shows how you can move this product out of the DRC or out of Rwanda. It goes to Asia. In Asia, they take the raw ore and then they make it into something that can be used in circuit boards, and then it will go to these places in China and Hong Kong where they'll make these circuit boards, and then it gets shipped back to us. Okay, we benefit from these cheap minerals that are coming out of Africa. I think everybody here has a cell phone, and I think everybody here has some. If you've got a cell phone, you've got tantalum, you've got tin, you've got gold, and you've got tungsten. You can't have a cell phone without those things. All right, so the Dodd-Frank Act was passed to try and stop the flow of conflict minerals occurring from nefarious means. It has not been that successful, okay? It's because what happens is you have people obtaining these conflict minerals from nefarious means, and they're still getting dumped onto the world stage, and we're still using them. So, and when I showed this to some of my children, I described this to them, they felt like, Dad, what can we do? We don't even know what we can do. I mean, if we're trying to pass laws to prevent these minerals that are obtained, through conflict, being dumped into our cell phones, and we're not even aware of how. I mean, we have to have a cell phone, Dad. You can't function in society without that. So it's not like we're going to have a boycott on cell phones. But what we do propose is this. A very tangible way that we can affect this is this. The conflict that is causing the trauma, there currently is no great way to treat the trauma that's occurring as a result of this conflict. If you want to have a tangible impact on that trauma, let's build up a health system that can treat the people that are suffering as a result of it. These laws are important. I'm not saying they're not. They're not. But they're being circumvented. And while we're trying to work out those things, these circumventions that are occurring, why don't we build up systems that can help the people that are suffering as a result of it? I want to turn this over now to Betty, who's going to give a little brief talk on self-harm.
Well, good day, everybody. I hope you can see me. So we're going to be talking about self-harm for the next few minutes with me. My name is Betty Kassa. I am from Ethiopia, and I am a pediatrician and a pediatric critical care specialist who was working in Ethiopia up until very recently. So this is going to be a talk about what is self-harm. Self-harm is the deliberate injury inflicted upon oneself as a coping mechanism for emotional distress. It can be performed in different ways, and all of them lead to an individual being hurt and having an impacted psychological trauma. Globally speaking, around 17% of individuals worldwide engage in self-harming behavior. at least once in their lifetimes. And the prevalence of suicidality or self-harm is significantly higher if somebody lives or is in an area that is war-affected as compared to non-war affected regions. When we come to Africa as a continent itself, it's a growing public health concern in the continent, and a larger percentage of suicide and self-harm happens in low and middle income countries, such as the ones found in Africa. And this is because there's a lot of vulnerable population in the continent of Africa, like the disproportionately high rates of self-harm due to people who are displaced internally or who live in war-affected areas, or because most or the majority of the population in the continent is young. Nearly 65% of the population is under the age of 18 years, so you can imagine. When we talk about the prevalence in Africa itself, the median lifetime prevalence of self-harm in the continent has been reported around 10% in adolescents, and there is a huge gender difference where women are more likely to be affected by it than men. And regarding the specific country where I come from Ethiopia, it is usually, it's starting to get, we're starting to see, as you can see here, an upward trend in the number of people who are affected by self-harm and self-harming behaviors. So one of the biggest issues we face in the continent is underreporting. We do not know how many people are affected because there is no reliable or comprehensive data on the subject, and also communities often attribute self-harm to spirituality or moral failings, or they generally discourage people from reporting when they have psychiatric problems or when they start have suicidal ideations in general. Some causes that are attributed to self-harm include the socioeconomic challenges that were being discussed by Dr. Heddings, such as poverty and unemployment. And when it comes to women, it's really largely dependent on the fact that women are more likely to be affected by domestic violence, sexual, emotional, and physical abuse as well. There is family conflict as another cause, and depression and previous self-harm are also reported to be reasons. When we talk about self-harm or any mental health problems in the continent of Africa, we have to think cultural and societal factors, because it's a deeply societally and culturally intertwined continent, and things like social stigma play a huge role for people not to report when they have mental health problems, and they do keep it inside because it's usually regarded as somebody who's being attacked by some spirits, or they're having moral weakness. That's why they're having these symptoms. So families tend to conceal people who do experience these problems, and they do not take them for medical care. The other is gender norms and inequity. This is a big problem, and there are high rates of gender-based violence in the continent, as well as women have limited autonomy. They're likely to live under societal pressures in the continent. And the most important, I feel like, is the collectivist norm that is within the society. One person does not make a decision for him or herself. Rather, it has to be seen on the context of how does it affect the community in large. So you're more likely not to be cared for, not to be seeking care as well. Conflict and displacement is another huge issue that we're going to be discussing in the next couple of slides, where refugees and internally displaced people are at higher risk for violence and loss of their home and their communities in general, and they do have less support as well, so they're more likely to be affected. The next slide is going to be me discussing gender-based violence, and it's going to be a few cases that I'm going to be presenting, and I wanted to present them because I wanted to highlight how the severity of the situation, just to give you an idea of it. So these are 3 cases that I have. They're courtesy from my colleagues, two from the DRC and 1 from Ethiopia. The first case is a 70-year-old woman. She was assaulted by rebels, and she was suffering fistula when she presented to the hospital. She hid in a forest for 3 years without any medical care because there was no access to medical care. The second case is a 23-year-old woman. She was assaulted by 15 men. She is from the Democratic Republic of Congo and had chronic incontinence because of the trauma that she endured. And when she came to the hospital, finally, when she was able to seek care, the surgeons were unable to repair the fistulas because they were so extensive. They had to try 6 times. She will remain incontinent for the rest of her life. The third case was a 13-year-old Eritrean girl, which is a country neighboring Ethiopia, and she lived in a refugee camp in the northern part of Ethiopia. When she presented, she was sexually assaulted by individuals who were around 10, and once the assault was over, she was burned. The reason she came to the hospital was because she had extensive burns and she was getting care for that. The common pattern you see here is the women did not come for their emotional trauma that they experienced. The only reason they were able to come to the hospital was because they were physically having symptoms. You can imagine, this is the tip of the iceberg, how bad it's going to be for the rest of the people who live in these conditions. When we talk about gender-based violence, it is violence against women and girls. Specifically, it is severe in rural areas and in areas where there is conflict. And reports indicate in the continent of Africa, around 42 to 90% of women, depending on the region, have experienced gender-based violence during their lifetimes. Factors that usually contribute is societal pressures, limited autonomy, and lack of support. The Ethiopian Demographic and Health Survey has reported that among the women within the country of Ethiopia, which is some 120 million people, aged 15 to 49, 23% of women have experienced physical violence and 10% experience sexual violence. And this is what is reported, mind you. And 4% of women who have experienced physical violence during their pregnancy. And the single largest reason for women experiencing violence is living with a man, married or otherwise. So when we talk about gender-based violence and self-harm, we should also see the impact it has. There is social isolation that comes from being abused, and this usually comes in the form of alienation from the community and being blamed for what happened to you. The other is the social impacts. There is increased risk for depression, PTSD, and anxiety. Because of the trauma that you endured, you are also being blamed. So this multiplies the kind of psychological trauma that you're going through, and you're more likely to resort to desperate attempts such as self-harm and suicide. And this also gets magnified when we talk about conflict and displacement. Self-harm comes in different forms, and the most vulnerable people during conflict and displacement are the refugees who are kids, who are women, and who are adolescents. And displacement camps report the highest rates of depression, anxiety, and self-harm when it was being studied across different parts of Africa. Many of these women, adolescents, and children exhibit signs of PTSD, and women who face sexual violence while their children are, women face sexual violence while children are forced to be recruited into the military and the armies. So you can see that these vulnerable populations are the ones that are being affected by it. A research showed that a refugee camp in the DRC had significant portions of their survivors of sexual violence reported trying to commit suicide or committing suicide. So what are the coping mechanisms for being internally displaced or being harmed in general? There are adaptive response and the maladaptive response. Mostly the adaptive response is when religion and spirituality support you. There isn't enough support in the community or in the country regarding psychiatric support or medical care, so most people go towards these institutions of religion and spiritual practices because they are the only options that are available. But as we're going to discuss again, those are not exactly the best options always. And most people resort to having maladaptive coping mechanisms such as harming themselves. When you talk about the long-term impacts of conflict and mental health, there is intergenerational trauma that comes with it. People who were raised in violent environments are more likely to have maladaptive coping responses, and they're more likely to go towards violent practices. And kids who are raised in these communities are more likely to not have options as well, as we're going to see on this slide. Research done on the effects of war and displacement in Syria showed that children who were born or raised in the time of war and displacement were more likely when they grow up to have decreased cognitive functioning, decreased emotional regulations, and also decreased affective processing in general. So what are the challenges for us to address this self-harm epidemic that we're seeing within the continent itself and other low and middle income countries? One, there is less access to support. So care providers such as psychiatrists are rarely available. There is poor funding for care for any psychiatric problems that people might have faced, or counseling in general has poor funding. There is limited access to care, specifically in displacement camps and rural areas as well. And there is shortage of trained professionals in general. The next thing is, as we said earlier, one of the coping mechanisms people use is religion. Usually religion is both a supporter and a barrier to managing these cases. When people are being blamed for what is happening to them on the guise of religion, then it's going to be a huge barrier. Whereas sometimes the community that is produced from these religious organizations helps people cope with the circumstances that they're facing in general. Some helpful interventions that are going to help is integrating cultural sensitivity. We need to understand that what works in the Western world is not going to work in the communal society of the African continent. So we need to kind of like combine the two and create a different way of approaching mental health in the continent. And we need community-based approaches as well, because it's a very communal society, as I mentioned earlier. And we need policy-level interventions that protect women, girls, and kids in general. Some of the most important things we need to do is we need to have awareness campaigns about these displaced people, about gender-based violence, and so on. And we need gender-specific interventions in general, such as strong laws that should be enforced against domestic violence and sexual assault. Most of the African continent, women who are married are not, if they are raped by their spouses, it is not considered as rape. So it's that kind of things that we need to address. The recommendations I have, and I'm sure there is going to be more that needs to be done. We need enhanced mental health funding and policies. We need resources to reduce stigma through education and advocacy for mental health. And we need to expand access specifically into the rural areas. Thank you for your attention. Amasaganalo is what thank you means in my own language.